Welcome to the France 24 debate. How far has Brexit created the current crisis in the United Kingdom? Britain's winter of discontent is what we're debating. Strikes, shortages, Brexit perhaps creating the perfect storm. Welcome to the programme. The UK then in the grip of this winter of discontent with strikes this Thursday across the board. Rail workers continue their rolling dispute that has stopped train services. They're calling for a better wage and a better conditions package. Health workers, nurses striking over similar issues. Stories of nurses turning to food banks to feed their families are not, let me reassure you, they're not anecdotal. It's actually happening. Hospitals are reporting right now being overwhelmed by a combination of a staff shortage and, of course, the ongoing pandemic situation. And thrown into the mix, of course, winter flu. Also on strike this Thursday across the UK, driving instructors, rural finance adjudicators and the famous London bus workers. It seems wherever you turn, someone is out on strike. Coincidentally, perhaps, it's 2 years since Brexit was enacted after the promises of a better Britain with us. Boris Johnson boasted an oven-ready deal. Now, it's all clearly not been the case, and in all sectors, life for many people is a lot worse. A poll in December said 51% now think leaving was a bad thing. Only 38% said it was still good. Those figures show there are many people who are very undecided. So the big display of Boris going through that wall with his bulldozer, get Brexit done, now all seems a bit hollow. Tonight we're looking for light at the end of the tunnel rather than having a row, but who knows, things might get heated. Let's introduce the people here to discuss this. Professor Duncan Fairgrieve is a Senior Fellow at the British Institute of International and Comparative Law and also a Professor at Paris Dauphine. Duncan, thank you for joining us here in the studio. Pleasure to see you. Joining us from Edinburgh is Alison Pollock, Professor in Public Health at Newcastle University. Alison, thanks for being with us. Great to see you. Joining us from Birmingham, Jake Scott is a doctoral researcher of political theory at the University of Birmingham. Great to see you too, sir. And from Lytham St Anne's in Lancashire, Hilary Ingham, Professor of Economics at the Department of Economics at Lancaster University, up there in the northwest of England, the region, well, my favourite region in the whole world. Great to see you, Hilary. Thank you for joining us. The whole situation, I'll start with you, Duncan, here right now. The UK, enveloped by the term winter of discontent is used. Obviously, it comes from Richard III, Shakespeare. It was used in the 70s to describe a very similar situation to what people are going through right now. So many people unhappy, turning to the last resort, going on strike.
That's right. I mean, the situation is pretty grim. If you like, sort of mixing metaphors, perfect storm, if you think about it, really. Cost of living crisis, austerity issues, public pay, but private sector pay as well. And I think a sort of general feeling of malaise as well, really. That has generated what we've seen, industrial action on a scale really we haven't seen in the UK for a long time of this nature. I don't think it is inaccurate to say it's almost moving towards a general strike. I mean, there are obviously individual industrial actions, but I mean it's picking up momentum. And as you can see with the train drivers at the moment, I mean it's almost sort of been ongoing for. Since before Christmas. I mean, that's a long period of time to affect people, that people not going to work, etc. So, I mean, there's a whole sort of general hit, I think, on the economy this is going to result in as well.
OK, Duncan, thank you for that. Let's go to Hilary Ingham, Professor of Economics at Lancaster University. Hilary's in Lytham St Anne's in Lancashire. Hilary, thanks for being with us. Duncan describing the basic situation. In terms of how you look upon this, I mean, clearly the economy isn't functioning because the greater number of people say they can't make ends meet. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think it is a fair assessment. I mean, the UK economy is in a pretty poor state. I mean, I think what we have to remember is that this has gone back a long time, so it's not really recent. So Britain has been struggling since the financial crisis. So we've had low growth, low productivity, and that has meant wages have been kept down, and we've fallen a long way behind countries like France and Germany. And then on top of that, the additional pressures with the energy prices and everything and the overall cost of living, and that people really are feeling that they can't manage. And of course, in the case of the UK, which was on your clip, we've got Brexit as well, which has, caused labour shortages. So we really are in a very difficult situation. So although, we are not unique in Europe, it is going on elsewhere, we are suffering more.
Perfect storm, as Duncan pointed out. Yeah. Hilary, thank you for joining us. Do stay with us. Jake Scott next in Birmingham, a doctoral researcher in political theory at the University of Birmingham. Jake, thanks for being with us. Your take on the situation. Clearly, there are so many unhappy people across the UK right now. They can't be all wrong, can they? Surely change of some kind is needed.
I agree that there is definitely change that's needed. But if we actually look at the reasons that people have been striking in individual sectors, I think we can diagnose this problem a lot clearer. As has been pointed out, this isn't necessarily a general strike yet. But if we look at the rail strikes, these tend to be in response to a lack of pay rises over 3 years. Brexit has been a legal reality for only 2 years, which means we can't really blame Brexit for that. It may have played a part in exacerbating the situation, but really the planned nationalisation programme by the government has exacerbated this more than Brexit could have done. If you look at the NHS, this has been a long-term situation. I mean, this has been going on a bit. In the last 10 years, we've had about 5 strikes with the NHS that I can remember on junior doctors alone. In terms of the postal sector, there's strikes going on in response to an announcement in October that there are going to be 10,000 jobs cut. And in terms of university, well, again, this is a long-term scenario. So personally, I think Brexit is actually irrelevant when it comes to the strikes that we're seeing now. I believe that Hillary's right that there's a labour shortage that's sort of been created or exacerbated by the Brexit situation, but I don't think that that's actually got a direct correlation with the strikes that are happening.
OK, Jake, I think many people will agree with you that there is a multifaceted aspect to what is going on. Some might disagree with you about Brexit, but obviously everyone's having their say, and thank you for having yours. Alison, can I bring you in, Professor of Public Health from the University of Newcastle, speaking to us from Edinburgh, I understand. Of course, the Brexit angle from Edinburgh is very different, isn't it, because Scotland voted to remain?
Yes, that's right. It did. Nevertheless, Scotland is very dependent on Westminster for its grant. So anything that happens in Westminster reverberates in Scotland. And of course, it's the same workers that are striking north and south of the border at the moment. But I think the story that hasn't been told, Brexit is part of the story. But I think, as the other speakers have said, we've had 30 years of progressive dismantling of our public services and privatisation and cuts in real-term wages. And that's been part of the privatisation effort, where you get also deunionisation and real-term reduction in pay. So nurses' pay has reduced by about 20% in real terms over the last 10 years, which is why you're seeing so many going to food banks. So really, this crisis is really a culmination of 30 years of progressive dismantling of our public services, disinvestment, and a huge privatisation programme where actually a lot of money now is being, especially in health services, but the other sectors as well, is being diverted to large multinationals, equity investors and bankers. And so actually a lot of the money is leaking out of public services. We see that in rail, in Royal Mail, the postal services, and in the NHS. All of these have been privatised significantly over the last 30 years.
Alison, can I stay with you and talk more about the effect on the NHS? Because you were mentioning about nurses being poorly paid. And I think everybody, regardless of their political leanings, at some time in their lives or the lives of someone in their family, they'll say, thank the Lord that nurse or that doctor was there to do what was necessary to ease someone's pain or to save their life even. And people will say this, and I think they will believe it, but it never gets translated into a significant pay rise or conditions improvement for these medical professionals. Why is that happening consistently?
Well, I think it really comes down to political will and the will of the government. And so there's a lot of public sympathy, not just for the nurses, but the physiotherapists who are also coming out on strike, the ambulance workers who are also striking, and also, as you say, junior doctors and doctors. In real terms, all of their pay has fallen. But actually, it's partly that the political will hasn't been there, and it's been coupled with a programme of disinvestment and privatisation, where billions of pounds worth of contracts are now leaking out of the system very inefficiently to the private sector, and COVID has been a cover for that. So we saw tens of billions of pounds of contracts being awarded to private companies, which either did not deliver or did no work. We know that the acute hospital sector, for example, really did almost no treatment during COVID, and yet they were given very large contracts and contracts that are continuing. So the story is more complicated. And the other story that's not being told in our National Health Service is the way in which it's being privatised within. So at this moment, the NHS we are creating a big two-tier system, and the NHS is actually treating private patients preferentially over NHS patients. And that has been made possible by legislative changes over the last 12 years. So we have the perfect storm is a culmination, not just of COVID or of Brexit, but of 30 years of policies which have shrunk our health services, but also our public services, which are rapidly withering away. And the strikes that you see are just symptoms of that. But of course, on the other side, there's the public, who are also the strikers, who are not in receipt of the services they need. And that's not because of people striking, it's because of the real cuts that have taken place in the levels of service provision. And that includes education, health, across the legal sector, justice, in every single sector that you could name. So really, we're on a downward spiral in the UK, and other countries in Europe would do well to learn from our example, because we've trailblazed many of the policies that other countries are adopting, especially privatisation and outsourcing. We've become much more like America than any other country in Europe.
That issue, Alison, of a two-tier health service, a two-tier NHS health service, I can back it up from my own family's experience. 2 of my children needed operations. We were told there's a waiting list if you do it on the NHS, but if you'll pay, we can get you in probably in a week or 2 weeks' time. And to me, that seemed really bad. As it turned out, we stayed with the NHS. My kids are fine. Thank the Lord, they're fine. But that two-tier system left a bad taste in my mouth. Duncan, can I bring you back in? The OECD, based here in Paris, not too far from this studio, they say that Russia is the only G20 economy predicted to do worse than the UK in 2023. How does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a great degree of incompetence at a high level. I mean, George Orwell described England as a family with the wrong members in control. That's quite prescient. You do get the feeling over recent times that the political class has let down the citizens. There was an interesting article in The Economist just before Christmas. Looking back at the recent Conservative leaders, it was a bit like a reverse ascent of man, going down and seeing just getting steadily worse, and resulting obviously in that farce that we saw. It'd be funny, except that it leads to what we see, and I think all the speakers up to now have made the important point. It's just not a short-term issue. It's been bubbling away. It's been created over actually quite a long period of time. It's coming to a head now, as we've seen, because of all the factors which are coming together at the same time. But I think the causal factors you can trace back, and hence the sort of, to the financial crisis, probably even before that as well. And I think the other point which hasn't been mentioned is inequality as well, that you see, if you look at the stats, public sector pay has not gone up. And in real terms, in fact, as was just said a minute ago, has gone down. Private sector is a different story. It hasn't gone up hugely across the board, but I think we're all aware of the fact that certain sectors have done relatively well. And it was just said a minute ago about the sort of private sector contracts, etc., that were dished out during COVID. That generates, I think, if you like, a very unhealthy kind of feeling about the system, which I think has also fired a lot of the notion of discontent. It's more than just economic. I mean, it clearly is economic because of the level of inflation so high in double figures, and yet increase in pay that's been offered is so low. So there is obviously an economic pressure. But I think there is that feeling, that hence your title, Winter of Discontent. It's a sort of more general malaise, as it were, which keys into all these sort of factors: inequalities, unfairness. Some have done well, and of course the final point is, of course, that during COVID, the sort of professions we relied upon to get us out of COVID, the medical profession, transport, to keep the country going. I think looking back and thinking, huge sacrifice, and yet we've just sort of been, what return is there for us? And I think the nurses, the junior doctors, the physiotherapists, etc., are saying we really gave a lot of ourselves during that time, and now we're just sort of being abandoned. And I think that creates a general malaise, as I said, which is not healthy.
Duncan, thank you very much. Let's go to Lytham St Anne's. Hilary Ingham there, the Professor of Economics at Lancaster University. Hilary, this issue of inequality, I'd like to get you to talk a little bit about this. When I was a teenager, late 1970s, early 1980s, I was brought up not incredibly far from where you are right now. Not as far north, but just the other side of Liverpool. And the unemployment level there was 52% in the town where I grew up. And that was pretty dire. And the sense of levelling up since then, I'd use the term levelling up because it's in fashion in the UK at the moment, isn't it? It hasn't really happened, has it, over that time? The north-south divide hasn't really been erased. There are more opportunities down in the capital than there'll ever be in the north.
No, it hasn't been erased. I mean, Michael Gove was charged with levelling up. There were some minor measures were put into place, but it didn't really make much difference. And we've actually heard today that Keir Starmer is sort of going to go down a similar route because he wants devolution going to local authorities, in some hope that will spread the wealth really across the country. But it hasn't really happened. And of course, there's not a great incentive for labour mobility because although you might be able to find, better paid options in the southeast, then house prices are a great big deterrent for people to move. And also people have got family ties in their local areas. But levelling up is a very, very difficult thing to achieve. It hasn't been achieved in the past. I can't see there's any immediate prospect of it happening, although it is on the agenda. But, as has just been said, that the UK hasn't really had a particularly strong ruling political class over the last few years, culminating in the debacle we saw in the autumn. And prior to that, of course, whatever we think about Brexit, it did divert their attention from other key priority areas. It was supposed to bring everything. It was going to deliver, reduced immigration. It was going to deliver economic growth. We were taking back control. But it wasn't really very clear how it was going to deliver any of this. And in some ways, it sort of, bogged down in the entire system. And I mean, even now, they're trying to get through Parliament, revoking hundreds and hundreds of EU laws. So really, our political system's in a bit of a sort of deadlock. It's not really moving anywhere particularly.
Indeed. And those, just staying with you, Hilary, if you don't mind, those EU laws that you're talking about, of course, one of them has resulted in raw sewage being dumped into the sea off the British coast, which clearly is no good for anybody. Pledges that we saw on the Big Red Bus, for instance, during the Brexit campaign turned out to be fantasy. It never, ever happened. And the NHS, as we've discussed, is in a dire stage right now. But for ordinary people, and I think perhaps you know this already, a fall in living standards, the biggest ever, is predicted, the biggest ever since records began back in 1956-57. This idea that the average household in the UK will be worse off than its counterpart in Slovenia by the end of this year.
I mean, it's true. And I mean, you only have to walk around the streets and just talk to people casually. Everybody is mentioning it. I mean, even people with, reasonably well-paid jobs, even above average salaries, are looking to turning down heating, wearing jumpers. I mean, we are facing a very serious crisis in this country. Obviously, a lot of it is external and it is hitting other countries as well, but we have got additional pressures. And as has been said, we've had problems with our public services, privatisation, stagnant wages, stagnant productivity. So we are suffering more than most. And this is going to be a very, very difficult winter. We've got inflation still in double digits. And although that's predicted to come down, it's going to stay fairly high all through 2023. And there's no indication that the government are going to immediately backtrack and offer workers the kind of wage increases they're looking for. So I think we've got very hard times ahead.
Hilary, thank you very much indeed. Jake Scott, I hope you've been able to follow what's going on. I know sometimes when we're watching from afar and joining in like this, it's not that easy, but I hope you've been able to follow the gist of what people are talking about. Earlier, you were telling us that Brexit isn't to blame for everything, and I don't think Brexit is to blame for everything. I think everybody agrees with that. Well, nonetheless, there have been clear issues that have been created by Brexit. It's fair to say it hasn't worked, has it?
There's a couple of things that I think are worth picking up that's been said. One is one that you yourself said, which is that the promises on the side of the red bus actually turned out to be fantasy. That's not true. That the £350 million a week figure translates to £18 billion. And immediately after Brexit, or after Theresa May's government began, £18 billion a year extra was promised to the NHS, and that's risen by about £30 billion over the last 3 years. So it didn't turn out to be fantasy. It actually turned out to be less than we spent. Another thing that's been talked about as sort of a way of blaming this is privatisation. Well, at the University of Birmingham, at the Institute for Local Government, there's a lot of research that suggests that privatisation is not a problem. Privatisation done badly is a problem. So I believe that privatisation done badly with the NHS is certainly to blame. But I don't believe that privatisation in general is a bad thing. So when we talk about the long-term impacts on this issue, I think the main thing we actually have to talk about is the key point of lack of political will, but not just in the sense of the current government or even the previous 4 governments or even necessarily the Blair governments. It's the fact that we've had a progressive movement away from unitary government in this country to devolved and hollowed out government over time. The hollowing out thesis is a major explanatory factor in the fact that the British government has become less responsive to crises over the last 30 years. So I agree the last 30 years has been essentially the period of growing crisis. But I don't believe it's due to privatisation per se. I believe it's bad privatisation. But I also think it's the fact that the constitutional settlement in this government has changed dramatically in that time. And our government is not as responsive as it used to be.
I'm not going to row with you about the red bus. I'm going to bow to your superior knowledge. Most people say that what was written on the bus didn't materialise, but I was just basically reflecting what they were saying. But I'll bow to what you're saying. Are you also saying that if basically Westminster had more power, they could actually resolve the situation? Because I don't think anybody would be convinced by that, would they?
I'm not saying that they'll be able to resolve the situation, but I think that the attitude of government in this country has been a progressive movement away from unitary government to not just devolved governments, but hollowing out governments. So when we talk about privatisation, privatisation is one part of a wider attitude of government that government can't respond to these problems. And actually, government is a major player in responding to these problems. So I'm not saying that government alone is the answer, but it seems as though the attitude amongst the political class in this country for the last 30 years has been that government is increasingly not an answer to problems. And actually, we need to be a bit more responsive and a bit more proactive in how we govern this country in terms of responding to crises.
So when Keir Starmer says, Jake, that he won't be able to when he gets elected, and the polls say that Labour would be elected if there was an election tomorrow, he's saying that spending your way out of this crisis isn't an option. Is that how you see it?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't necessarily think that it's a case of not spending our way out of this crisis. I think that, for example, nurses definitely deserve to be paid more. I appreciate I'm speaking with bias here, but university staff definitely deserve to be paid better and more than we do get paid. But also I think that it's like I say, it's not just a problem of spending. It's a problem of an attitude of government and the role that government plays in this country. Government needs to be more proactive, needs to be more responsive, and needs to lead in response to these problems.
Jake Scott, thank you very much indeed. Alison Pollock, back to you, Professor of Public Health at the University of Newcastle, joining us from Edinburgh. Edinburgh, of course, in Scotland. Scotland voted to remain in the Brexit referendum. Alison, you've described to us the problems affecting the NHS and other sectors around you with your knowledge and filled in a really harrowing tale, really, of what is happening. In terms of what happens next, is it a question of giving more money to these sectors? Would that be, for you, something that would solve the problem?
Well, of course, money always helps, and there's no doubt about it. But I think the big question is, where is that money going and how is it being spent? And what we know certainly in the health service is that an increasing proportion, one of the reasons why wages have been kept so low and staff vacancies are so high is because a lot of the money, instead of going into wages, has been going into very expensive public-private partnerships, joint ventures. So now our hospitals, most of them have been designed, built and operated by by companies who include equity investors and large banks. And they're taking enormous chunks of the annual budget, about 12% every year, out of the operating budgets of hospitals. On top of that, you've also got contracts that are being now awarded to the private sector, and the NHS capacity being devoted now increasingly to private patients, so that the staff and the services are being diverted into the private sector. And of course, many of these companies are owned by multinationals with equity investors, with shareholders, and they're always concealing where the money is going and how it's being spent. So really, it's not just about government, it's about where is Parliament in all of this? Because Parliament is failing to hold its government to account properly and to scrutinise. And indeed, in the case of many of the services, including health, Parliament has stepped back from the health service and abdicated its responsibility completely. So this is no longer about what government's doing, it's where is our Parliament? And one of the tragedies we have is we don't have a written constitution to hold Parliament and the government to account. I'll just stop there.
I was going to ask you about the figure that was on the side of the big red bus as well, because Jake corrected me about sort of the how that money was used. Have you felt any benefit from that, do you think, in the NHS sector where you are?
There's absolutely no evidence of any of the so-called benefit. And of course, there's lots of ways you can reconstruct the figures. The NHS in real terms had a fall compared with what it would normally have expected. So as a proportion of GDP, spending on healthcare actually fell. And of course, it's also been concealed by the fact that billions of pounds were poured into COVID. So mass testing, PPE, masks, the Nightingale hospitals, the pop-up laboratories. And of course, that was mainly all private provision. There was no rebuilding of the public capacity that had been destroyed. And much of that money was wasted and lost. And indeed, there are big investigations now ongoing, as there are many countries, over corruption and the conflicts of interests of our MPs as well in this process. And health is only one part of that story.
Indeed, that sleaze that you're talking about, these cases that are going through the courts, it's all widely reported and widely documented, points many questions and puts some big question marks over the behaviour of the government. Alison, thank you very much indeed. Back to you, Duncan, here in the studio. The situation, as we're hearing, is very complex. It's on many different layers, which makes it all the more difficult to unpick. Alison talking about, there's no constitution. You get down to a basic like that. You could go back to the 13th century and try perhaps to reconstruct from there. That's not possible, obviously. But how does a government go about satisfying all the people, the train drivers, the ambulance drivers, the doctors, the nurses, the driving instructors, the train drivers, the train staff, all the people who are striking, the bus drivers? We can go on. How do they go about trying to basically make them happy if it's not just about spending money? Clearly there are other factors, but it's a big question. Where would you start?
So it's a big job.
Yeah.
And there's a sort of feeling, I think, of a huge amount of inertia. I mean, was it yesterday, day before yesterday, that the Prime Minister delivered his sort of big first speech? There's not a lot of ideas bubbling out there. There doesn't seem to be very much being done to try and, from Central, I heard what Jake said about hollowing out, but I mean, there doesn't seem to get a great amount of action to actually sort of grapple with these problems as well. I mean, clearly they are in a difficult situation. But I think there's a feeling that probably what is required is a change in government. And there's a sort of fin de regime feeling. And this happens, obviously, it happened at the end of the Blair and Brown era, happened at the end of the Thatcher and Major era as well. But you do get a sort of feeling that we're coming to the end, lost ideas. The quality of the government, as I said earlier on, is the team. It's not really the sort of a dream team running the country, and it's reflected really in a lack of action, a lack of focus. Really, look at the train drivers' strike. Pretending that this is not the government's problem, but we all know that it's not an entirely privatised industry, and that they are, of course, very influential. So I think the big problem in the background, of course, is inflation is very high. It's going to start reducing, as we just said earlier on. If there are big wage settlements, that obviously is, get into a spiral inbuilt, sort of bake-in inflation. So there are lots of difficult decisions to be made. But I think we heard Keir Starmer today trying to set out his stall, trying to sort of propose solutions, trying to explain what he would do, etc. I mean, I think when you look at the offer that is out there, there's not really much being proposed from the current government. So I think probably. I think he probably is going to require a change of government, but that's a long way away. And I think, as you said, there are a lot of very thorny issues that need to be resolved. And it's looking increasingly a little bit like a Ken Loach movie. A bad Ken Loach. I mean, I love Ken Loach, but I mean, it's looking a little bit like that without, there's not much, where's the happy end? And I think that we're only going to actually move things if there are ideas, if there's engagement, if there is sort of grappling with these problems. And in the backdrop, of course, there is Brexit. And I don't agree with what was said by Jake earlier on at all. The figures just don't bear out what he said. I think Brexit has played a role in this. It's going to be difficult to reverse that, but we're in a new paradigm now where we're starting to see things play out, and the figures are not good for the drop in GDP. And if you take a counterfactual, what happened if we hadn't left the European Union, and you compare it, it doesn't look good. And that, that obviously is generating, again, if you lose 6-7% of your GDP compared to what you would have been if you'd been, stayed within a single market, that is a lot of money. And that's, which has been squandered, coupled with what was just said by Alison a minute ago about, the corruption during the COVID saga, government contracts, etc. You can start to see why the resources are not there. It's not because, it's not just because we're in a difficult situation. It's because of mismanagement.
You can see why the red bus with the figure of 350 million diverted from the EU to the NHS was a good slogan to get people to vote to leave. Saying that your average UK household will be worse off than its civilian counterpart by the end of 2024. Not knocking Slovenia, but that wouldn't have been a great slogan to get people to vote to leave the EU. I think we all probably agree on that one. Let's bring in Hilary once again from the Lancaster University, Professor of Economics. Hilary, thanks for being with us. I know you've been listening very intently, and I know you've got lots of suggestions and ideas. I'm tempted just to say to you, if I gave you the keys to number 10, how would you solve the situation?
I think it's a very, very difficult one at the minute. I mean, what Duncan has said is quite right. I mean, there are no real ideas on the table at the minute. The only thing that's come out of Sunak really is that he might impose these minimum service levels, which might mean, that the nurses and the ambulance workers have to actually provide cover even when they are striking. I think the only thing really, you've got to go back to grassroots, you've got to look at productivity. I mean, I think one of the ideas or one of the things they are going to do that is possibly a move in the right direction is to look at all of these people that mainly after the pandemic left the labour market. Now, with the cost of living crisis, it might well be that some of those people are regretting that decision. So maybe if we can get some of those people back into employment, that might be a small step in the right direction, but it isn't going to right all the wrongs overnight. This is going to be a very long road we've got to go down. And I mean, increasing productivity in the UK has been a problem that successive governments have failed to, tackle. They haven't mastered it. We haven't had sufficient investment, and that goes hand in hand with productivity. And we've been a poor economy in terms of economic growth, which is really key to prosperity for all of us. So I think they need to start with very grassroots things and try and build things up such that the overall economic prospects for all of us can be better.
Those prospects you're talking about, obviously you're saying this isn't something that's happened just under the current Conservative government. It's gone on before. This is a roll-on effect.
It's gone on for decades and decades and decades. But with the other factors that have come into play, like the pandemic, like the worldwide cost of living crisis caused by the Ukraine-Russia conflict, it has just, made it so much worse that it's actually reached a sort of boiling point now, and it's all come to a head. And now we've got, this industrial action, and really nobody seems to have a way out of this in the short term, because there doesn't seem to be any indication that the government are likely to back down. I mean, they may be willing to engage in talks, but they are not going to be putting the sort of pay offers on the table that these workers want. And at the same time, the nurses, the train drivers, etc., seem determined to sort of carry on with their strike action. So the two sides at the minute, they seem so far apart, and there doesn't necessarily seem any mechanism to get them closer together in the short term. I mean, it might be that the government say, in the case of the nurses, it could implement next year's pay increase earlier. It could bring it forward, but I don't think that is going to satisfy them. So at the minute, I can't see how this is going to be resolved.
Hilary, thank you. We're running out of time, but I'm going to take time because we need it to speak to Jake Scott, doctoral researcher in political theory at the University of Birmingham. Jake, we've appreciated all your input so far. Can I ask you about the solutions going forward here? Because clearly, if we're hearing from other guests that there seems to be no solution on the horizon, one has to be found. And one thing I heard about was that the government's intending to sort of introduce laws that ban people from striking. That doesn't seem like a very progressive move.
It's a very, very good question. So I'd like to make 2 points on this. The first is regarding the laws that you just mentioned about preventing people from striking. There are some industries where striking is forbidden, and one of those is the military. And the military was drafted in order to provide services that ambulance drivers and nurses couldn't provide just before Christmas, which is an enormous shame. But it kind of runs counter to this idea that you can never do it. And I'm not saying that you should or you shouldn't, but the idea that you can't do it clearly isn't true. So that's the first point. I'm not saying, of course, that you're saying you can't do it. I'm just making it clear.
We
that
understand you, Jake. Go ahead. We understand you.
The second point is the sort of historical comparison. So throughout this, we've kind of used the winter of discontent as an historical comparison, but in 1979 and right the way through the 80s, we went from one of the sort of a high level of nationalisation and regulation in the economy, around about 20%, to being one of the most deregulated economies in the world, never mind in Europe. So deregulation isn't really an option anymore. We don't have the option to cut even further because we can't. And the other thing, of course, links back to this first point of changing the laws about striking, because that was one of Thatcher's most important things. She took on the unions and so on and so forth. You don't really have the legal recourse to do that. So the historical comparison is useful in the sense of pointing out the similarities, but insofar as the similarities are the practical circumstances, not the solutions. So we can't look to the past for the solutions. What we have to try and do is find some progressive, like you say, move into the future. But I agree with both Duncan and Hilary. I don't see any way out of this right now. And I think one point that I would disagree is not so much that we need a change of government, but that we need a change of governance, which I think comes back to my point just earlier of how this is about attitude. This is not just about how the government is established or where power lies, but it's about the attitude to using that power. As Alison rightly pointed out, Parliament is absent in all of this. It's not been holding the government to account. and it's not been doing the job that it should be doing. So not only do we need to change that and our attitude to government, but we need to start actually thinking about what government should be doing in this country.
Jake, can the Conservatives be trusted, given what we've seen throughout the pandemic, the misuse, the mismanagement? Not my words, these are words that have been highly documented across the political spectrum. Can the Conservatives be trusted to do this?
Well, the disappointing thing is I'm a Conservative Party member, but my answer is no. I really don't believe the Conservative Party is trustworthy at this point.
Jake, thank you for your honesty. Thank you very much indeed. This is possibly going to be the final statement. Let's go to Alison Pollock in Edinburgh from the Newcastle University Public Health Department, where she is a professor. Alison, I gave Hillary the keys to number 10 to cure the situation. I'm going to ask you what you think would be needed and required to stop nurses striking, to make doctors happy, to get the NHS up and running and working again. Where does the money need to be spent?
Okay, well, what's needed first is a moratorium on the NHS treating private patients, full stop. Millions and millions of patients now are queue jumping and being treated in the NHS, where it's the same doctors and same staff. And we need to rebuild capacity. Now, that's a short-term measure, but that would increase capacity overnight. Second thing is to stop putting all the contracts into the private sector and rebuild the NHS. Thirdly, you need legislation. Parliament needs to get involved again and to bring forward legislation to reinstate the NHS, because the NHS has been progressively dismantled. And that would include national terms and conditions of service, because part of the reason why the unions are also striking is exactly because of so much privatisation happening in mail, in royal, in the postal services, in rail and in health, right across the sectors. And of course, as privatisation increases, union membership falls, and so do terms and conditions, because it's much harder to do national pay bargaining when you've got lots of private companies employing staff, and you actually get a race to the bottom for many staff, and then you get growing inequalities and growing disparities between staff groups. So some groups, some consultants can earn a lot of money, surgeons, for example, whereas others who are treating people with mental health problems or older people, they will earn far less, and the Americas are a really good example of those inequalities. But ultimately, it's not just about health services. This reconstruction needs to happen in all public services. And as everybody has said, there is no vision, neither on the Conservative side nor on the Labour side. And of course, we had a vision which brought in the welfare state after the Second World War. That was a huge vision that brought in a landslide government with a vision. And it's a political vision, and then the will of the people who will vote them in, which will make this happen. But at the moment, there isn't a vision, and the vision has to be for redistribution, reducing inequalities, and that means some groups and some sectors will have to share and have their money taken away, and that includes businesses and increasing corporation tax, in order to lift those 40% of children who are currently living below the poverty line out of poverty, because this is a disgraceful situation that we're in, with more and more people sinking below the poverty line and a very small group of people accumulating more and more wealth. So at the end of the day, it's redistribution, and public services are one of the best ways of redistributing, not to the private sector, but into reinvestment and rebuilding. And that needs vision, and that means our MPs to take that vision, and that's got to be articulated through the population.
Alison, thank you very much indeed. Alison Pollock, Professor of Public Health at Newcastle University. Thanks to Hilary Ingham at the Lancaster University Department of Economics, Professor there. Hilary, thank you very much indeed. Thank you to Jake Scott, Doctoral Researcher of Political Theory at the University of Birmingham. Jake, thank you very much indeed. And thanks to, here in the studio, Professor Duncan Fairgrieve, Senior Fellow of the British Institute of International and Comparative Law, and of course at Paris Dauphine University here in Paris. Thanks to you all for watching too. Stay with us. More to come, live from Paris.